So, in my first speech, I introduced Glasgow and gave a very brief overview of its long history. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about modern day Glasgow and a little bit about my experience of living there. So I was born and raised in Glasgow to parents who were also born and raised in Glasgow, and their parents were also born and raised in Glasgow. Although, if we do go back a couple more generations, both of their families actually came over from Ireland during the Great Famine. And in fact, my surname, which is McGregor, it might sound very Scottish, but the fact that it's MC and not MAC shows that it actually went via Ireland. And it's actually quite an achievement that the surname still exists, because the clan MacGregor actually faced proscription in Scotland for 2 centuries. So this meant that they couldn't use the surname, they couldn't own property, and they couldn't even possess a knife. And in fact, they were legally hunted and killed. So that's probably why they went to Ireland at some point. But anyway, I digress. Let's get back to Glasgow. So, like much of the UK, after the Second World War, Glasgow saw significant populational growth. That's when we saw the so-called baby boomer generation. In the 1960s and the 1970s, like many cities, Glasgow embarked upon a programme of slum clearance. So what this meant was that large areas of the city where there was a lot of overcrowded housing and terrible kind of living situations, a lot of these areas were demolished. Some people were rehoused in flats, and others were rehoused in what we call overspill towns. So, for example, East Kilbride or Cumbernauld. Now, this might seem a rather innocuous detail, but it's actually quite integral to my family's own history, as my father's family was offered a house in Cumbernauld. And in fact, most of his family, in 3 or 4 generations, they actually still live there. Cumbernauld it's only 10 or 15 minutes outside of Glasgow. And if you've never been to Cumbernauld, I really would recommend that you look up some photos later on, because it's been voted several times as the ugliest town in the UK. And my mum and dad lived there when they first got married, but my dad often says that the best thing that ever happened to him was my mum's refusing to stay there and live there for the rest of their lives. So while we did spend every second Saturday there during my childhood, we were lucky to live in a slightly less ugly area. But that was the trend. People who come from Glasgow tend to live in Greater Glasgow. The city centre, however, has definitely been cleaned up, and it's really been revamped in recent decades. There's a project called the Avenues Project, which seeks to transform the city centre's streetscape and public realm, making it more people-friendly, more attractive, greener, more sustainable, and more economically competitive. And since the 60s and the 70s, the job market has also changed significantly. We witnessed the decline of some of the great industries like shipbuilding, which had their heyday on the River Clyde, and the decline of many other industries. And this gave way to service jobs. According to figures from 2001, over 60% of the labour market in Scotland is made up of service jobs, and Glasgow is no different to this. Glasgow still struggles, however, to shake off its post-industrial image. And it's the first thing people seem to say when they tell you that they've visited Scotland. They say, oh, Edinburgh, it was beautiful, it was magical. Glasgow, yeah, it was okay, it seemed a bit industrial. And while it might not be as pretty as its East Coast counterpart, it has a lot to offer. And in my experience, people that have lived or studied in Glasgow tend to be very enthusiastic about it. For example, in terms of sports, it's the home of the two biggest football clubs in Scotland and two of the biggest clubs in Britain. It's also home to the National Football Stadium. It held the Commonwealth Games in 2014, which brought with it significant investment in housing and facilities, and this was left as a legacy for local populations. There are many famous sports people that were born there, for example, Alex Ferguson or David Moyes, well-known football managers. It's also home to a host of museums and art galleries, such as the Kelvingrove Museum, and it's the birthplace of the renowned architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Music is another integral part of the culture of this city. In my teenage years, I would go to concerts every week. We were often spoilt for choice. In fact, there were so many venues, and every band that would tour around the UK, Europe, or the world would always make a stop off in Glasgow. Some of the biggest bands in the world were actually discovered there, especially at a place called King Tut's, which was actually a rite of passage in the Glasgow music scene. I'm talking about bands like Oasis, The Killers, or Radiohead. And now I could go on giving you reasons why Glasgow is better than Edinburgh, or why you should visit Glasgow. Maybe it's parks, it's bars, it's nightlife. But ultimately, I think that the City Council's slogan hits the nail on the head. It's the people that make Glasgow. Thanks.